Hey, welcome back. We are back once again for our monthly Grail tier list update. I meant to get this out earlier in the week, but here's a list of excuses as to why I couldn't. Anywho, I'm here to update the list once again for all your viewing pleasure and disagreements wherever you may so choose to put them. This month, we didn't get as many new notable skill additions, although there were some definite highlights. I would say a lot of the highlights more so came from the free units that we got, more than the skills themselves, but I'll get into that when we get there. For now, let me quickly go over how I individually rank these units. For context, there are 3 tier lists. There's an Aether tier list, a Summoner Duels tier list, and an Arena tier list. The main 3 game modes that most people are generally going to care for. Everything else more so falls into a PvE category, and it really doesn't matter what unit you build at that point. During each of these tier lists, there will be a ranking given to each of these units, and the unit that has the highest cumulative ranking based on the best placement total will be the unit I recommend at the end of the video. There will be multiple units I do recommend, since I don't think there's one definitive Grail unit that you should build, and there's enough out there in the game to where you could probably find a lot of candidates for who can honestly be one of the most valuable Grail units right now. But if you are looking to build a Grail unit for a specific mode, then you can take any list at their own individual value. And if you have any feedback or questions that you want to ask or leave, put them in the comments and I'll get to them as soon as I can. I'm not necessarily the best when it comes to responding to comments, but I find that when it comes to videos like these where I'm trying to be informative, that it's important that I try to clarify and help as many people as I can. So with that out of the way, we might as well get right into the Aether tier list. The tier lists are mainly going to be comprised of 5 tiers. You obviously have like the 2 high ones, but then you also have the middle of the road that you could probably consider if you really want to, and then the lower 2 that may not necessarily be as desirable, but there are always means of getting around certain predicaments or hurdles depending on the unit you try to go and use. And when it comes to ranking the 2 new units that we did get and Brunya's Refine, I find that outside of Brunya's Refine that the new freebies that we got are considerably high quality, surprisingly, for Intelligent Systems free-to-play standard. I know we've had good free-to-plays in the past, but something like Summer Male Shez, who has a dual-phase Brave Speedy Lance with a really good stat spread and Kanto remaining +1 in his weapon, is really good for just a variety of builds. The Brave effect built into the weapon means he could just go into all sorts of roles, whether that's Gale Force, Enemy Phase, Pure Player Phase, Mixed Phase. Brave in and of itself is a really good effect to have. And when you're a melee flyer, you also have access to stuff that can not only benefit yourself, but can also benefit allies in the process. And comparatively to a lot of other units in the Grail pool, he's definitely fairly comparable to something like Har. They both have dual phase Brave, they're both melee flyers, and where I would argue Har more excels in the enemy phase, Shez excels better as a mixed phase unit. And the reason being is going to be the Kanto remaining +1. So Shez can still enter combat, retreat back as much as he can, and then still enemy phase with a relatively good amount of bulk. Granted, his defenses aren't necessarily that high, but Guard Bearing 4 grants 60% damage reduction for the first combat and 30% subsequently after, with no check required outside of just enemy phasing, which is incredible. On top of the fact that he has Brave attacks, meaning that if the foe has some sort of guaranteed follow-up or any ability to strike twice, he's always getting 2 attacks out before the foe will get a second strike in, assuming it isn't a Brave attack, and that will more than likely lead to a lot more favorable matchups for him. It's somewhat weird to compare because on the surface they do relatively the same stuff, and to be fair, a lot of their gimmicks are relatively the same, but as I did mention earlier, I think Har does succeed as an enemy phase way better, mainly because he has a lot more natural bulk, he has guard, and he has true damage reduction, and when you combine that with something like Guard Bearing 4, he is going to be tanking so much more than Shez could ever do. But Male Shez does have a really high speed set and a lot more flexibility in the player phase, whereas Har just is locked to enemy phase combat, assuming he is running Guard Bearing 4. And in my opinion, that flexibility is just enough to put him in the superb tier, both in Aether and Summoner Duels, but I'll get into that when we get there. For now, all you really got to know is that Male Shez can do quite a fair amount of stuff because he's fast and he has dual phase Brave. The build you've been seeing on screen isn't the only thing he can do, but I found that it's something completely different comparatively to a lot of the other units of his archetype, but I find just for differentiation's sake, it's worth just putting this. It's not even a bad build whatsoever, but you will require some sort of support that allows him to fall into vantage range relatively fast. And then we have Murdoch, and I would say Murdoch also got treated fairly well. I think the only big hindrance is definitely going to be his color, because right now red nukes are out of control. We have so many red nukes everywhere. It's not even just limited to Aether rates. But for somebody like Murdoch to have a really good min-max stat spread on top of a DC weapon that grants a guaranteed follow-up, and it has Daunts built into it, which is generally the term I refer to when it comes to attack debuffs, and it scales really high too. It can go up to -13 depending on what penalties are on the foe. He's going to be tanking really, really well against a lot of threats that aren't armor effective red units. And while I do think he's definitely one of the better free-to-plays we've gotten in a long while, he still has a lot of the issues that a lot of his green armor counterparts without PRF still fall into. Even if they can't replicate a lot of the stuff Murdoch can, they're still falling to the same threats. And in my opinion, they're probably going to be around the same tier. Not necessarily saying that Murdoch is on the same level as something like Flame Emperor, but I also don't think his performance is nearly high enough, especially in something like Aether Rates where you can't even use saves in something like Light. And if you're putting him on an Aether Rates defense sitting, he's still prone to a lot of the other stuff most of the other armors in this category are prone to. I would still say he's on the upper echelon, but I don't think the tier difference, at least in this category, is that big of a deal, especially for something like Aether Raids where a lot of stuff just works because of how lopsided a lot of the game mode is for Aether Raid's offense. But speaking of which, I also demoted Winter Felix and Winter Ignatz solely on the basis of the new skills that we got on Physical No Follow and Magical No Follow. What initially put Winter Felix and Winter Ignatz above their contemporaries had to do with the fact that they had access to a really good amount of damage reduction skills, including the Arcane and Savvy Fighter 4, and access to stuff like Armored Beacon and Armored Flow. So while they didn't have access to the likes of Hardy Fighter, which is definitely one of the most prolific skills for any sort of armor tank, they were still shrugging off a lot of damage solely based on the amount they were getting from their weapon and B slot. And with the amount of speed that they did have, it was entirely possible to avoid doubles altogether and just mitigate the amount of damage you were taking in general. Even if their damage output wasn't exactly the greatest, they had a lot more going for them comparatively. But with the recent addition of Aether and Ascended Fur bringing these new no-follow skills, their damage reduction capabilities aren't nearly as strong. And while it's difficult to say how common these are going to become, the fact that you can put these on ranged units means that their threat range is significantly higher than if you were able to just put them on a melee unit. And because of that, I find that they're just going to be a lot more threatening comparatively. I still think they could do a decent job at it, but their effectiveness is clearly stifled because of these skills. Following that, we have the decent tier, and most of this is going to be about the same for a lot of the characters. A lot of the red mages I decided to boost up not only because of the initial access to Arcane Eclipse, which I didn't find to be enough on their own, mainly because they could just go into a Hardy Fighter and that would be it. But now with the addition of something like Magical No Follow and Brash Assault 4, I find that most of them are good enough investments to where you can invest in any sort of red mage you like from the Grail shop, and they should be able to perform relatively well, whether that's just for eating hits or just dealing damage. A lot of them are going to be running the same thing for the most part, so it'll ultimately depend on their stat line at the end of the day. Some of them you could speed stack if you really wanted to, and you could go Magical No Follow. Some of them you could also go Brash Assault 4 with Remote Mirror, so that way you can also retaliate with a huge amount of damage or eat a hit if you really need to. The guaranteed follow-up is a bit redundant, assuming that the foe doesn't have any sort of follow-up denial stuff, unless it's Hardy Fighter, which also has no follow in it. But you're mainly taking Brash Assault 4 for the damage reduction properties, because that combined with a Remote Mirror, you're shrugging off a lot of initial first hit damage, which is really good. But it is also worth mentioning that if you're not doubling in the process anyway, it doesn't really matter. You can still run something like no follow-up if you want to secure the guaranteed follow-up, but anything that has full no follow-up present is going to negate it regardless. But I do think that there is plenty of potential to be had here, especially with the amount of skills that infantry have access to. And other than that, the only unit I demoted this time around was Reeve. I don't think Reeve is bad by any means, but I find that his niche isn't nearly as coveted as it once was. There's still going to be plenty of instances where there's going to be extra movement on something like an Aether Raid's defense, but I find as we're continually going into the game, there's more and more warping effects rather than anything that grants extra movement, and there's still plenty of that can occur. And as a result, I don't find that Reeve to be nearly as compelling as he once was. Before we move on to the final two tiers, I do want to quickly mention Wings of Mercy 4. I don't think this necessarily solidifies any new placements, but I do think it's worth highlighting, especially for Gale Force comps, because now you have a lot more flexibility with your HP thresholds. A lot of the older units, especially Gen 1 units, probably had a lot of HP distributed to them, so falling into something like a Wings of Mercy range was definitely going to be a lot more difficult, especially if the foe couldn't counter attack, but now with the 60% that you get from Wings of Mercy and the additional 2 spaces that you get from it, I found that it was at least worth bringing up, especially if you are looking to build any sort of unit for Gale Force composition purposes. And then finally, we have the other 2 tiers, and I also ended up promoting some of the red mages due to the Remote Mirror Brash Assault combo. Again, given how common null follow-up effects are, it's not always going to be a gotcha for these types of archetypes, but it is something they can take advantage of for what it's worth. I don't think they're particularly amazing at it, but I find that there is a niche to be had. Whether or not it will work is ultimately dependent on the foe, as with a lot of matchups in general, but I think there is enough potential here to at least give it a promotion. It's not exactly the highest, but it's still something that they can do. 50% damage reduction on the first hit is nothing to scoff at whatsoever. And if you are able to double through it, chances are you're going to be doing a lot of damage in general. Otherwise, there's Scion Nana, and the reason I'm promoting her up here too is because of Seaside Parasol that we just recently got from Summer La Rochelle. She's still lacking in the ability to just get specials off very easily, but with the Wrathful and Dazzling effect that you can get both at once on top of the amount of attack that you get from the weapon, and it grants additional speed, and it inflicts guard on saves, I think it's a decent enough staff. I don't think it makes Nana incredibly good, but she has enough skill accessibility to where I think keeping her in the I don't know man tier is not really fair. And lastly, there's Brunya, and I don't know what they did with Brunya's refine, especially considering the last one was Cormag. I was hoping it wasn't going to be tethered by some sort of supportive unit gimmick where she has to be supported by an ally, which isn't great, especially if you wanted to put her on an Aether Raid's defense setting. I'm not really happy about that, and I don't think she has enough of a presence on offense to really warrant anything else. I'm hopeful that with the Arcane, she'll become a lot better, because the weapon honestly isn't doing enough for her to become a lot more compelling as a combative unit than she was prior to the refine. Granted, it does grant a lot of stats, but that's really the most you're going to be getting out of it at the end of the day. I don't think it's really worth much at that point, sadly. And that's going to be about it for the Aether Raids tier list. Next, I want to move to the Summoner Duels tier list, because even though we didn't have a lot of new additions in terms of skills, there's still plenty of stuff to talk about, such as Summer Milshez and Murdoch again. I went over it a fair amount in the Aether Raid section, but Summer Milshez is basically a counterpart to Har in my opinion. He doesn't have nearly as much enemy phase prowess, but he has a lot more player phase flexibility, which is something I really appreciate. The Kanto and Dual Phase Brave that he has built into his weapon means that he can still initiate combat and then retreat back to an ally, so he can not only provide guidance support, but still be in guard bearing range. Even though he loses that on to 60%, he's still getting flat damage reduction, and he's really fast, so it's going to be easy enough to avoid a lot of doubles. I find that this is just absolutely incredible for a free-to-play unit. The weapon itself is already really good, but with the stat line in tow and the amount of skill accessibility that he does have, I think he's definitely one of the more compelling units that you can run in something like Summoner Duels. I already went over like crazy about how Har is really, really good, as well as Cormag. I personally prefer Har because he has unconditional 2 attacks no matter what, but with Shez being really fast, he's going to be able to shrug off a lot more attacks, even if he's taking a bit more damage in the process. He could also get a lot more damage out comparatively. And I find that he's just going to be a really amazing unit to bring to Summoner Duels. If you can properly invest into him, I think he's going to pay off really well. And it really does help that he's modern, so the barrier of entry for something like Flowers is not going to be nearly as difficult. And Murdoch is also really good for what it's worth. I think Murdoch's only issue, and this is still a pretty prevalent issue, is his color. He has a really good min-max stat line, and he has a decent enough weapon. He has DC guaranteed follow-up and can inflict a bunch of attack and defense debuffs, which is really good. But the problem is that we just have a lot, and I mean a lot, of prominent red nukes that are absolutely going to shred him. We're talking Valentine's Crom, who is ever so common because his utility is amazing. We have Legendary Veronica, who is a really good player phase nuke because of enclosure and tempo and all that stuff that she gets in her weapon. And we have Legendary Hinoka, who recently came out. She has a lot of attack, and she has armor effectiveness and breath and Kanto and 3 movement, and you know the drill. It's a lot of heavy red nukes that will absolutely ruin his day. I think in terms of sheer tanking prowess, he has the capabilities to do it, but the meta right now just isn't in his favor. And while I would like to put him above solid and put him in superb, I think the color isn't doing him any favors, which is why I'm going to put him in solid. But unlike the Aether it's tier list, I did end up pushing a lot of the axe armors down because I find that comparatively they just aren't as compelling as Murdoch. But before I go into that section, I quickly want to discuss Cornelia, because as the game continues to go on, legendary male Robin continues to be everywhere. And because of her weapon scaling off visible debuffs, on top of the addition of magic no follow, she's going to end up doing a lot of damage in general. Even when Robin has his double unity shtick up, she's still going to be inflicting a lot of damage, mainly because her weapon scales off the amount of visible debuffs that they do have. And while debuffing the foe isn't exactly the greatest idea if they're being granted unity, her dominance effect does mean she could still output a fair amount of damage, whereas a lot of other units of her kind probably weren't going to do the same. And because of that, I found that it was at least worth promoting her to solid. Magic no follow is what sealed the deal for me personally, but I think whatever else she brings to this table is still relatively solid. And then we have the decent category, and there's just a lot of promotions because, yep, you guessed it, it's going to be a lot of the magic no follow and the brash assault remote mirror type stuff. Magic no follow is very good. It gets around stuff like Lucia and a lot of the other god swords that may have otherwise had an absurd amount of damage reduction. Granted, they could still go into stuff like godlike reflexes, but that's only going to be the first hit. And assuming you were running special spiral with an active special, that could have easily gone into the special itself. I think it's a good counterpart to have comparatively, although I wouldn't say one is necessarily better than the other. It will just ultimately depend on the unit. But with the recent addition of these skills, I find that it's good enough to bring them up. You could still run a similar set of attack speed unity, oath, and then magic no follow with the arcane, so you could just output a really high amount of damage assuming you're debuffed. Or if you're a bow, you do have the privilege of getting first hit damage reduction in your weapon, so that combined with the A and the physical no follow in your B slot means you can shrug off a fair amount of damage and shrug off a lot of damage reduction on the foe. And of course, you can still replicate that on a mage with remote mirror and brash assault 4. Brash assault 4 is really just going to be there for the damage reduction and the reflection back. I don't think the guaranteed follow-up is going to be nearly as compelling, but it's still there if you really need it. You can either run that on a mage with the arcane, or if you have it on a bow, you don't even need to put your A slot for remote. You can instead run something like Unity and get a potentially higher amount of buffs, which is really, really nice. But other than that, I also decided to promote a lot of the melee flyers because as the game continues to go on, a lot of the prominence for melee flyers, regardless of a lot of the stuff they may or may not have access to, is becoming a lot more compelling comparatively to a lot of other units of their archetype. Guard bearing 4 with Guidance 4 is just a really nasty combo, and if you have a good amount of bulk and access to a decent enough weapon, I think you're going to be performing well enough. And like I mentioned earlier, I decided to demote a lot of the green armors. They just aren't really favorable right now as far saves, and as near saves, they're really not going to be doing much better anyway because we have stuff that has armor effectiveness and a really high amount of red melee threat, including, but not limited to, Brave Seliph. And lastly, we have the other two tiers. I did mention earlier about how I wanted to promote a lot of the melee flyers, mainly because they had access to Guard Bearing 4 and Guidance 4, and that's no different here whatsoever. You have Jerome and Michaelis, who also got promoted. They don't have access to the best weapons, but I think Arcane and Seahorse Axe are compelling enough to where you could probably use them. Even if they aren't nearly as good as their contemporaries, I think they can still work well enough because the amount of skills they have access to are really, really powerful. You also have stuff like Arette and Valentine's Titania, who aren't exactly the best either, but with Remote Mirror and Brash Assault 4 granting damage reduction, they can still shrug off a lot of first hit damage, assuming they aren't getting doubled in the process, and retaliate with a second attack that could potentially kill. Arette does have a lot better attack comparatively, although Titania does have the speed. I think they both bring enough to where I would personally promote both. Even if they both aren't exactly the best, they can still do a good amount with the tools they are provided with. Same thing really with Cyan Nana and Female Robin. Seaside Parasol can grant a lot of attack during combat, it has additional speed, and it can inflict guard on saves at the start of a turn, which is really good for messing up their damage reduction capabilities. I think it's good enough to promote them, especially since they still have access to stuff like Poetic Justice, Unity, and Oath and all that stuff. I think it's good. And as for female Robin, while I wouldn't say she's necessarily the best unit, she still has access to the likes of Snow Globe, so with something like Legendary Robin support, she could still act as a relatively decent nuke if given the proper tools. Granted, if you already have Legendary Male Robin, you may as well just use him, but he's pretty prominent and you're going to be seeing him everywhere, so why not try and pair him with something that could potentially do some work if you really wanted to do some fun theme team times or anything. I don't think it's bad, but you're definitely going to be heavily reliant on something like that. Or if the foe has some sort of Legendary Robin with them, then you know what? It could work out there too. Otherwise, yeah, more green armor demotes. If I'm demoting the ones that have access to Hardy Fighter, I'm most definitely demoting the ones that don't have access to Hardy Fighter. I don't think Winter Bruno and Winter Jafar are completely awful, but I think comparatively to something like Flame Emperor and Ludwig, they're not going to be doing nearly as much. And that's going to be about it for the Summoner Duels tier list. Lastly, we have the Arena tier list, and this is going to be relatively quick. Your BSC is all that really matters at the end of the day because you need high score to get high rewards and score really well, and that's about it. Summer Male Shiz scores around the 758 area, which is still pretty nice if you really wanted to bring something that has guidance support and a lot of access to good skills. I don't think it's bad whatsoever as a merge project, but it is worth noting that Murdoch is tied with Vigard as the highest free-to-play scoring unit in the game at a whopping 762. The performances will absolutely vary depending on who you use it on, but he is the highest scoring unit alongside the guard, and with a free distant counter PRF and a really good bulk and skill accessibility, I don't think you could go wrong with Murdoch whatsoever. I would say it's a lot better than running anything from the 756 category, which is basically any sort of unit that has to run a dual skill and has a PRF. They can probably score okay, but I don't think it's really dependable nowadays. Nor is anyone below that. The ones that don't have access to PRFs or don't have access to skills that allow them to score the same as their contemporaries. Especially the armors who came out really early into the game who score 752 or less. I would not bother with these selections whatsoever if you're looking to score, but they are options if you really want to use them. Just keep in mind that they're not going to be doing as much as a lot of the other ones above them. And that's going to be about it for the Arena list. Before we do close off the video though, I do want to give a list of units that I personally think are worth investing into at this time based on the cumulative total of the lists. Granted, you can still take every list at their own individual value, but I think in terms of just getting the most bang for your buck, these 9 units are probably going to be your best bet. I think if you're looking for somebody to do a really specialized niche, whether that's just enemy phase stuff or just really good tanking, you couldn't go wrong with somebody like Har, Cynthia, or Cormag. I think in terms of utility and enemy phase prowess, they're some of the best that we got currently. If you're looking for somebody that's not only good in combat, but can also score well for Arena and get you more rewards, Lumera, Vigard, and Murdoch are great options since they score some of the highest, and 2 of them do have decent enough PRFs that you can use there. But if you want to build a unit that you can use in a lot of areas that really isn't pertained to something like Arena, you could build somebody like Zephiel, Fallen Delthea, or even Summer Male Shiz. I think Summer Male Shiz is a fantastic addition to the Grail pool, same thing with Murdoch, but it is worth highlighting that some of these units are going to be better in some areas than others, so just for the sake of it, I did put them into their each category and what I think they specialize in way more. Obviously, general purpose isn't really a specialty, but it does mean they are a lot more flexible comparatively to other units, and I think that's valuable in its own right. But that's going to be about it for the Grail video. Let me know what your thoughts are down below, and if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.